All right, so welcome to the last video of our nervous system discussion. So in this last video, we're going to focus all on the central nervous system, look at the different components and talk about the functions of each of those components. So the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay? And the central nervous system has a couple of different components or structures in the body whose functions are to protect it and to make sure that no damage comes to the central nervous system. The first of those are the bones in our body, or that's part of the skeletal system, specifically the skull and the vertebra. So their sole purpose is to encase and protect the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the brain and the spinal cord are also surrounded by some layers of membranes that are known as meninges. And we have three meninges, the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater, that again surround the brain and the spinal cord to serve as kind of an extra layer of protection. And then what also surrounds the brain and spinal cord is the cerebrospinal fluid. And this basically kind of circulates around the brain and the spinal cord and kind of bathes it in that fluid. And it really serves as a shock absorber. And the cerebrospinal fluid is actually made and produced within the ventricles of the brain. And we'll show you exactly where that is in the next slide. Now, the last kind of protective mechanism for the central nervous system is this blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier prevents the entry of specific chemicals and pathogens from getting into the central nervous system. But now there are some chemicals that can get through that blood-brain barrier, one of them, for example, being alcohol. So here's a figure of the brain, the spinal cord simplified, and you can see the skull surrounding the spinal cord. The blue fluid is the cerebrospinal fluid, and that cerebrospinal fluid is made in the ventricles. And you can see the ventricles at the side view here, and then from the front. So here's the right ventricle, the left ventricle, and then in the center you have the third ventricle with the cerebral aqueduct, and then towards the back, the bottom near the cerebellum, you have the fourth ventricle. Okay? And again, that produces the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain and the spinal cord. All right, so we've got the skull, we've got the cerebrospinal fluid. Next, we're going to look at the meninges. So the outer meninge is the dura mater, which is here, which is separated by the arachnoid, or from the arachnoid, right, from another membrane. And then, so the arachnoid is a gray here, my marker's not wanting to work. And then between the arachnoid meninge and the pia mater is the cerebral spinal fluid. So the pia mater is directly covering the brain itself. Okay? And then so that cerebrospinal fluid is between the arachnoid and the pia mater. So again, the three different meninges, the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. And if we were doing an in-person lab, we would be dissecting, I think it's sheep's brains. You would be able to see the meninges on the brain and be able to dissect through those as you look into it. Okay. And so looking into the central nervous system, the spinal cord is basically the freeway for information. So it's that super highway that's transmitting those electrical signals and impulses. So all of those action potentials between the brain and the rest of the body. So the spinal cord is essential for connecting the brain to the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now, the spinal cord is made up of an outer portion and an inner portion. The outer portion is referred to commonly as white matter, and the inner portion as gray matter. The outer portion of the spinal cord consists of myelinated nerve tracts. So ascending nerve tracts are the sensory nerves, and descending nerve tracts are the motor nerves or motor neurons. And so remember, sensory is bringing it to the CNS, so it makes sense for them to be going up to the brain. And then the motor neurons is bringing information from the CNS, so going down away from the brain towards its associated tissues. Now, the gray matter contains the dendrites and the cell bodies of the neurons. Okay, and so if we look at an image here, right, we're going to zoom into this area here of the spinal cord. We're going to look at one vertebra with its cartilaginous disc. Right? And then you have the spinal cord with the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater, and then the nerves, associated nerves, and then the spinal cord itself. And if we do a cross section of the spinal cord, this is what it looks like. Okay? So we have our gray matter, which looks like a butterfly, and you have the white matter that surrounds that. So this white matter is the myelinated axons that are running kind of up and down, depending on if it's sensory or motor neurons or motor nerves. And then the gray matter is the dendrites and the cell bodies. And again, that's used to transport information to and from the central nervous system. Now, once the information gets to the brain will then take that information and process it and then send it back out via the motor neurons to tell the different tissues and different parts of the body to do whatever function is necessary. And so in that essence, the brain is the command center of the body. It basically controls almost everything that goes on there. Like we mentioned with reflexes, some functions that can occur without going through the brain, but the brain really regulates a lot of our biological processes. Now, the brain has three different divisions that we're going to go over. It has the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. So the hindbrain is responsible for basic, automatic, and vital tasks. The midbrain is coordinating muscle groups and focuses on sight and sound. And then the forebrain looks at sensory input and complex behavior. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the hindbrain, and we're going to look at the different parts of each of these divisions in the brain. So the hindbrain is actually the oldest, most primitive portion of the brain, and earlier brains in earlier animals really look like just the hindbrain. So really primitive ganglia, kind of just a mass of neurons that we think through evolution just kind of developed into, say, like a cerebellum, your medulla oblongata, and then as evolution happened and continued, you get larger cerebrums and then all of the associated specific portions of the human brain, structures of the human brain. So we think, though, that earlier animals, so like your earthworms, that actually have a mass of nerves in the anterior portion of the body, the head region, starts out as basically like a ganglia. So like just a mass of cells that really resembles something like the pons or the cerebellum, right? And so the hindbrain is made up of three basic parts. Two of those we just mentioned, the cerebellum and the pons, and then the other is the medulla oblongata. And as we've learned through previous chapters, the medulla oblongata is really important for regulating things like respiration and blood pressure. Now here's an image of the three divisions of the brain. So you've got your hindbrain, midbrain, and then forebrain. So for the hindbrain, you got your cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, and then the pons, which is right here. And then we'll come back and look at this and discuss more about the midbrain and the forebrain kind of as we continue. All right, so first in the hindbrain, the medulla oblongata. So this is really important for connecting the spinal cord and kind of connecting the spinal cord to the brain. And like we mentioned, it controls these automatic functions for internal organs. And like we talked about in previous chapters, it regulates heart rate, blood pressure, and also regulates respiration rate in response to CO2 and O2 levels. And remember, CO2 is indirectly. Okay? What's also interesting is motor nerves cross over in the medulla oblongata. So for example, if you have the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain, right, and here's the medulla oblongata, the nerves actually cross over, right, and that's why the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So that's really interesting. So that crossover happens in the medulla oblongata. Man, and just like a side note, I can't say the word medulla oblongata without thinking about the movie Waterboy and the interaction that Adam Sandler has with his teacher. I just, every time I teach this lecture, it just always pops in my mind. That's super funny part. If you haven't seen that movie, and I recommend watching it. It's an old goodie. And another part of the hindbrain is the cerebellum. Cerebellum, basic body movements, coordinating those basic body movements. And it helps with the skilled movements like swinging a bat, hand-eye coordination movements, using a keyboard, tying a shoe, right? So a lot of dexterous movements. And if you consume alcohol, it's going to disrupt the cerebellum function because that alcohol can cross that blood-brain barrier. And that is why you can't really perform those easy, normal tasks after you've consumed a lot of alcohol, because the cerebellum has been, somewhat compromised, and you can't be very dexterous under that state. Now, the last part of the hindbrain is the pons. And so the pons is connecting the higher brain centers with the spinal cord. And so it's coordinating information between the cerebellum and the upper areas, so the midbrain and the forebrain. And it aids the medulla oblongata in regulating respiration. Okay. All right, so that's it for the parts with the hindbrain. Now we're going to look at the midbrain. Okay, so we said the midbrain is really important for functioning of vision, hearing, and then our sleep cycles. And so it coordinates movements of the head related to vision and hearing. It controls your eyes and the dilation of those eyes, of your eyes, depending on the external stimulus. And then we have neurons that are important for regulating our sleep and wakefulness cycles. We got one group of neurons that have this steady stream of action potentials to the cerebrum that says, okay, keep us awake and keep us alert. And then we have another group of neurons that's known as the sleep center. And whenever it's time to go to sleep, our bodies will, send information or send action potentials from these neurons that will release serotonin. That is what allows us to induce sleep and makes our bodies become tired. So here's some examples of kind of electrical activity during wakefulness and sleep. So here's your wakefulness, electrical activities, deep sleep versus REM sleep. You don't have to know or memorize these patterns. This is just more of a FYI, just kind of showing you what it looks like. Now with the forebrain, this is where emotions and conscious thought are really controlled. The forebrain is receiving information that really focuses on kind of regulating emotions and our thought processes. The forebrain is made up of the cerebrum, the limbic system, the thalamus, and hypothalamus. A lot of you are probably more familiar with the cerebrum, so the larger portion of the brain, and then kind of in those, underneath those, you have your hypothalamus, your thalamus, and your limbic. So hypothalamus is regulation of homeostasis. Thalamus is the receiving, processing, and transfer center of information. And then the limbic system really involves kind of emotions and memory. So that's kind of where we store our memories, is in that limbic system. And kind of looking at the limbic system, it includes all of the structures that together control emotional behavior and kind of motivational drives. And so motivational drives being things like, seeking food, seeking thirst, sexual gratification. So anything that like drives you to undergo a certain behavior, and that motivation behind it is generally derived and controlled in that limbic system. But these behaviors can be and are modified by the cerebrum as well, and so they're kind of working in unison. The hypothalamus serves as a gateway to and from the limbic system. Right? So information goes to and from the limbic system via the hypothalamus. Right? We can see that here. Right? So the hypothalamus is here. The limbic system is this green area within the brain. And you can see this kind of connection, right? Where you have information with the thalamus, right? Then you have your hypothalamus, and it's kind of directly connected with the transfer of information into that limbic system. Now here, this yellow structure here is called the corpus callosum. This is actually what connects the hemispheres of the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is part of the forebrain, so it's the larger part of the brain, again, that most people are familiar with, and actually what you think about most of the time when we say the word brain. And it focuses and deals with higher brain function. And so the cerebrum is divided into right and left hemispheres, and those hemispheres are connected by that corpus callosum. And so it's nerve tracts that allow those two hemispheres to actually share information. And then our cerebrum also has an outer layer that's known as gray matter, and it's called the cerebral cortex. And we'll actually look at the cerebral cortex in a little more detail in the next couple slides. Now, the cerebral cortex, it has a lot of different functions. It functions for memory storage. Remember, we said that the cerebrum can work with the limbic system for memory. So it helps with memory storage, abstract thought, awareness, control of skeletal muscles. And it's actually interesting because depending on what area in the brain you look at the cerebral cortex or examine it, that specific area could control a different part of the body. And we'll kind of look at that here in a second. But now, the cerebral cortex can be divided into 4 different lobes that actually correspond the name with the areas of the skull that they are protected by. So for example, the occipital lobe is in the occipital region of the brain or the skull. Temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and frontal lobe. So hopefully you remember those terms from the skeletal lecture. But those lobes are found in those same places that correspond with where those bones in the skull are found. So the occipital lobe processes visual information. Temporal lobe is auditory, spoken, and written information. Parietal lobe is kind of sensory information. And then the frontal lobe is motor activity, conscious thought, and speech. All 4 lobes together work together in terms of memory storage. So here we have a figure showing the cerebral cortex. You can also see the corpus callosum here connecting the 2 hemispheres. So you have your occipital lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and then the frontal lobe. You can see that frontal lobe here. It just tells you all of the information we kind of already went over. And so one thing I want to point out here is that A lot of times you hear people refer to their brain as like, oh, all that gray matter, right? Of all that gray matter. Well, a lot of the interior of the brain, especially the cerebrum, is white matter. That outer layer, right, is your gray matter. That cerebral cortex is the gray matter, right? That white matter is the inner core, and that is ascending and descending nerve tracts. Okay, and then that gray matter is actually the inner neurons that's integrating and processing information. So that's a little interesting. Now, like I mentioned, you can look at the cerebral cortex, and depending on where you are in the cerebral cortex determines like what area of the body is responsible for controlling. So for example, this area is swallowing, right? Whereas this area is like your hips and your toes, right? And then, for example, this area is like your pharynx and your tongue. And this area here, again, is your leg, your hip, your trunk. And it's interesting that it's, you know, this region is kind of like the head region. So pharynx, tongue, gums, teeth, lips, face, nose, right? So it's like your head region. It's like your lower region, your abdomen region, right? And so it's interesting in that different areas control different parts of the body, but then there's also like regions where different parts of the body are controlled as well. So pretty interesting figure there. And then lastly, memory involves storing and retrieving information. So for example, we have short-term memory and long-term memory. So short-term memory is known as a working memory. And this is information from like the last few minutes, last previous couple hours. And that short-term memory is actually stored in the limbic system. Okay? Now, long-term memory, where you have information that you store from, you know, several days ago to several years ago, actually causes permanent changes in your neurons, and you get a development of additional synapses in the cerebral cortex. So your brain is actually changing its neuron shape and kind of the amount of synapses, connections that you have based on how much long-term storage or when you're adding long-term storage, right? Which is really interesting. And so that's, you know, just the difference between short-term and long-term storage. Okay. And so that's it for our chapter on the nervous system. As always, let me know if you have any questions, any concerns. You can get up with me via email, or you can mention in the discussion boards any questions that you have. And as always, I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you in the next module.